Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Audit Committee meeting. Just before we start, unfortunately, Dan Schumann, the independent chair, has had to give apologies at the last minute. The Audit Committee's terms of reference state that an independent member needs to chair the meeting. It's suggested that Mike Langhorne chairs the meeting. Members, can I just get your agreement on that, please?
Agreed.
Right, over to you, Mr. Langhorne.
Hello, Richard and James.
Thank you, Matt. So I think just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. So if the members of the public in attendance need to use the facilities, those are located in the main foyer to the building. If there's a fire alarm, please leave the building by the nearest fire exit and make your way to W.H. Smith on Bridge Street. If there's an intermittent alarm, please stay in your seats until otherwise notified. Can I also remind everyone present to ensure their phones are switched off or placed on silent. I'll take it that members have all read the papers for this evening's meeting. I know they're very long, unfortunately. And as we have a number of items on the agenda, I'll try and ask those who are introducing them to spend no more than 2 or 3 minutes introducing their items. Now, I think before we move into the main items on the agenda, I'd like to propose just one change to the agenda. So we have Ernst & Young with us presenting the external audit plan for 2023-24, and that's at the moment in agenda item 9. My proposal is that we shift that to the very end of the agenda, so that what we can do is ask EY to introduce the plan, but I think that we have a number of questions on them, and I think what I would propose is that we then move into private session after the introduction, so that we can have a full and frank discussion on what that plan means and our level of commitment to some of the dates within that plan as well. Is everybody happy with that suggestion?
Agreed.
Excellent. Well then, if I could just move on to agenda item 1, and apologies for absence. Can I ask the Democratic Services Officer to read any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we have apologies. In addition from Mr. Schumann, we also have apologies from Councillor Ali, and Councillor Fareed is here as his substitute, and also Councillor Tholborn and Councillor Jones is here as his substitute.
Thank you, Matt. Well, I think in Councillor Tholborn's absence, who is the Vice Chair, we also need to appoint a Vice Chair for the meeting in the event that there are any tied votes where the Vice Chair will have the casting vote. I think my simple proposal there would be for us to nominate Councillor Jones, who is acting as substitute for Nick Tholborn, to act as Vice Chair in the event he's needed. Are all members comfortable with that as a proposal? Excellent, thank you. From then, I think we can then move on to declarations of independence.
Interest.
Declarations of interest. Can I ask any councillors or any other members present to declare any interests that may be disclosable for the meeting? Okay, thank you. So if we then move on to agenda item 3, and that's minutes of the meeting. Now, I think I've raised one question on this, Matt, with regard to the item, one of the minutes from the last meeting regarding the appointment of the chair of the meeting in the absence of the designated independent chair. Have we got any clear resolution on how we propose to address that issue in the minutes?
Yes, so the issue is that there is a typographical error in the third resolution of minute 60 of the minutes of the 18th of March. The final word should read unavailable rather than available. So the committee can agree these minutes subject to amending that typographical error.
Okay. Is everybody happy to agree that amendment?
Agreed.
Excellent. And in terms of the implications of that issue for the final terms of reference for the committee, do we have a way forward on how we're addressing that?
So are you happy for me to cover that now? So I have discussed this with Neil MacArthur, the Council's monitoring officer. Unfortunately, it was an administrative error that addition wasn't added to the proposed terms of reference when they were presented to full Council for approval. So a report will be taken to the next available meeting of full Council, which is in October, to further amend the Constitution to include that resolution that was made by the Audit Committee in March.
Okay, thank you. And could you just note that in the minutes as well?
Of course.
I think if we move on, do any other members have any other comments on the minutes or any matters arising from them? In which case, if there are no further comments, can I ask members, can I take note the actions and matters arising, and we look forward to further feedback on actions going forward. Oh, sorry, no.
That's item 4.
Item 4. Yes, sorry, if there's no dissent, are the minutes agreed, subject to the amendment that I've already proposed? Thank you. Then that takes us on to agenda item 4 and the matters arising. So can I ask Matt that you introduce the report?
Thank you, Chair. This is the standing item that was agreed by the committee to show the outstanding actions from the previous meeting, any outstanding actions from prior meetings and any actions completed since the previous meeting, and it is for noting.
Any questions from the committee on matters arising? Okay, can I take it we note the actions and matters arising and look forward to receiving further feedback as and when they're completed. I think that takes us on to agenda item 5 and the revised financial regulations. Can I please ask Emma Riding to present this report?
Okay, good evening all. This report is in front of you tonight to revise the Council's financial regulations. It's required, this requirement has been flagged following our self-assessment of our compliance with the SIPA Financial Management Code. This is forming a part of our much wider financial improvement programme, where we're looking at improving financial management across the organisation, looking at using our systems more effectively, making sure we've got training for budget managers and the finance team, and development of a budget manager habit guide. I think it's fair to probably summarise that the financial regulations haven't been reviewed for a long time prior to this. They were quite out of date. A lot of the changes that have been made to this bring them up to current standards. They've involved changing job titles, legislation, guidance, and reflecting our current processes in place. We did meet this week to discuss this prior to this meeting. There were a number of suggestions made at that meeting. They have not been made to the paper that is on the agenda today, but I can assure you that this will be going through to Constitution and Ethics Committee next week. The paper is published for that on Friday, and those suggestions have been taken into consideration in that paper. Following this evening's meeting, as I've just mentioned, these will be going to Constitution and Ethics Committee on Monday evening, and then they will go to full council in October. What I would like to say is that this is probably the first stage of reviewing these. As I've mentioned, it was quite a cleansing exercise. We've got much of a good standard. Later in the year, we're going to be looking at these again because the procurement rules come in, and that means we'll be updating our contract and procurement rules. So, as a result of that, we will have to revise the financial elements of the financial regulations again. So, we will continue to review these. We will update them from that, and going forward, we'll review them on an annual basis to make sure that they are current and fit for purpose. And on that note, I'll hand over if there's any questions from the committee on that.
Right. So, I know, Emma, that I owe you my list of observations. I think I had a slightly longer list than we went through at the pre-meeting. I will send those through to you as soon as I can. But are there any other questions in the meantime from other members of the committee? Councillor Farouk.
Thank you, Chair. Great report, and obviously it lays out the roles of the members and the directors and the employees and the audit committee. Do we have training arranged for all these different segments to ensure that everybody knows or refresh their roles or their part in the whole process?
That's a very good question. So we are at the minute developing the training programme for budget managers, and members have treasury management training, audit committee training. We've done an introduction to local government finance training. We will continue to look at all the different elements to make sure we are covering those. For example, there's obviously a section on debt and the purchase P2P system. that training is ongoing. That we're looking to incorporate into some lunch and learn sessions for staff across the organisation. So I can't give you an exact answer that every single element of the financial regulations is covered in training, but that is definitely what we are aiming to do, and there was already a lot of progress ongoing around that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, sorry, Councillor Antunes.
Hi, just have one question. If the old regulations are somewhat out of date at the moment, do they still apply until the approval of the new in October? Or whether there is a statutory requirement or shortcoming to be adapted until then?
Probably, in terms of constitution guidance, Neil, do you have a view on that?
I mean, strictly, I think the answer is they apply until vary in the proper decision-making process. So referral from here to Constitution and Ethics Committee and then the recommendation on to Council. I think what there have been changes in legislation, you would treat that as a consequential amendment that you would need to make anyway, because you can't apply old law. But I think in terms of the details of the regulations that are for the Council to decide, the existing financial regulations will apply, subject to consequential amendments between now and October.
Thank you, Neil. Any further questions before we move on to the recommendations? Okay, so if I could just move on to the recommendations, which are on page 13. It's recommended that the committee reviews the draft amended financial regulations, which I think we've done, and then refers the draft financial regulations to the Constitution and Ethics Committee for a final recommendation to full council. Can members agree those recommendations?
Agreed.
Thank you. The recommendations are therefore agreed. So then if we could move on to the budgetary control report. Emma, is that you presenting again?
It is me again, yeah.
Thank you.
I'll keep this introduction brief because it does feel like such a long time ago now that we finished the end of last year. But just for clarification purposes, this report sets out our financial performance for the year ending 31st of March 2024. This report has already been to Cabinet in June, and so it is here at this committee to keep this committee abreast of the financial position of the organisation. So we finished the year with an overspend of 1.2 million. Although an overspend, what I would say is that that is a much improved position to what we did report much earlier in the year when it peaked at over £6 million. So a huge amount of effort across the organisation has gone into managing spend and turning that position around to get to the position we ended in. You'll be able to see from section 4.1 in the report that we have been continuing on our improvement journey throughout the year. There's many achievements in there to celebrate across the organisation, such as successfully bringing in Serco, insourcing that arrangement, successful staff award ceremony. 99% of the savings programme was delivered, albeit sometimes by alternative solutions, but it was in the main delivered, and we've been shortlisted for awards. But, and there is a big but, there are financial challenges still ahead of us, and the executive summary does cover some of those challenges. We are facing high levels of demand for our services in adults, children, social care, housing. For the first time, we will probably go into a DSG deficit this year. We'll join about 130 other local authorities in that challenge. Interest rates are much higher now than they were a couple of years ago, so that is putting a strain on the council's cost of borrowing. Decoupling from Cambridgeshire, even though that gives us sovereign over our services in Peterborough and much greater focus of our services, it does come with an additional cost attached to that. And I should note that as the report sets out, our reserves balances are running quite low now. So that does reduce our financial resilience and our ability to respond to emergencies and our ability to invest in the future and transformation. Appendix C of the report sets out the 3-year MTFS position. So that has just it's been rolled forward to include the final 3-year, the final year, which sets out a 9.7 million gap. Again, I should probably note that that obviously was calculated now a few months ago. We have been working on that position since then, and the risk, as set out in the executive summary, it is quite significant. So on that note, that summarises the main focus points of the report, and I'm happy to take questions from the committee.
Okay. Thank you for that, Emma. Can I just open the committee then for questions? So, first of all, Councillor Farouk, Councillor Kayum, and Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Again, great report and tremendous effort from reducing from 6 million from back in November to 1.2 million in the house pressures. Quite a simple question. Obviously, the in-year pressures now already continuing from April onwards, and with significant pressures on children's services and other decoupling matters. How much is just the first part of the question? Is how much in total are we now at the moment with in-year pressures from April onwards added on to the 1.2 million we already have? Or is that too early to ask that figure yet?
We're working through our VCR report at the minute. Q2 report was over 8 million of pressure. That takes into account the additional cost of capital financing, the Ofsted ask, so delivering improvements with children's services, additional cost of children's placements. Those are the main ones. Some adult social care and housing. We've had 115 households in bed and breakfast at some point this year, which is high, not as high as other local authorities, but it's above our budget assumptions. So that is causing strain. Cecilia,
No, I was just going to say, when you say Q2, it was month 2, wasn't it? So
sorry, yes.
we're not halfway through here, so it's a bit. I think it might be worth adding as well, Emma, that we have put in place a capital moratorium to address the in-year position. We're introducing a recruitment freeze from next week, and looking at reducing agency costs as well. So there are some immediate measures that have been taken that will come in the Q1 BCR.
Thank you, Cecilia. Funny enough, that was my supplementary question, because I was going to say that a lot of those parameters are out of your control, apart from the capital budget moratorium and recruitment and those elements which you covered. Thank you.
Councillor Kim.
Thank you, Chair. Emma, thank you very much for a very detailed report. It's my first audit committee meeting, so I'm seeking to learn a new skill here, so apologies if the questions are rather trivial. My question to you is that it's stated in the report that the DSG reserves for the first time will be in deficit, and a plan stipulated forward. With respect to the Ofsted that we have coming up and the challenges with that, do you feel that that could feed into that deficit and indeed have an impact on what the outcome of that Ofsted could be and vice versa? Is there any projection about that scenario going forward?
Oh, that is quite a detailed question. So what I would say is the two are probably linked to some extent. So if you know, I was trying to make this really simple and it's sort of easy to understand. The deficit on the DSG will have a knock-on impact on our budget. For example, a lot of children that are, this is mainly down to SEND provision essentially, and the ability for SEND placements we have in the city. So a lot of those children, we are transporting them out of the city, and that has quite a significant transport cost. So that will obviously have a general fund impact. So if you assume that DSG is kind of out of our general fund for now, and that transport would have an impact on our general fund. So you'd see that come out in the BCR, contributing towards that 8 million or 10 overspend position. In terms of will it have an impact on the Ofsted ask? Yes, because I suspect that a lot of children that have SEND will also be probably a child in need and have social worker support. I'm not John Beggs, I can't probably advise how strong that link is between those two areas, but there's definitely some link there.
Fair enough. I guess the purpose of the question was to sort of have a bit of a hand on what the sizable impact is. of the deficit really, if anything else, so that as a sort of a cabinet we're prepared to anticipate those eventualities. But thank you.
I mean, the main thing with the SEND provision is that we need provision in the city essentially, because at the minute when you pay for alternative provision, it's much more expensive than paying for provision within the city, within a school. So, you know, some of the plan that we've been speaking to DSG about will be about, or the DFE even, will be about working with local schools around how they can have sort of hubs within the schools, or how they can accommodate that, or how we can create provision. So we've got some capital funding, I think about 11 million that came at the beginning of this year. It was again a sort of DFE reaction to the SEND situation across the country. So when we put plans in place for that, that will help create that capacity within the city and hopefully help us manage that pressure. I don't think anyone's cracked this yet. Essentially, there's over 130 authorities for the DSG deficit, so it really is a system-wide issue.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Move on to Councillor Jones.
Neatly juxtaposed, Emma, because you've said 131 out of 151. Now, it wasn't that long ago, or let me put it this way, we're not in that real bottom tranche. Who are the 20 that aren't in deficit and why? Are there any lessons to learn from them? But the other thing is that as this is a system problem, this is system-wide, is it's context. How do we fit in the grand scheme of things? We're not at the moment, I think the phrase is, we're on the edge of the woods. We're not in the woods, we're on the edge of the woods, looking outwards. We're trying to avoid going back in. So is there anything to be learned from the authorities that are closer to the edge than we are, or closer in the forest, or anything to be learned from the 20, which 20 authorities are making don't have a deficit, if you see what I mean? It's context.
So I can't name the 20 authorities off the top of my head, but I do, when we met with the EFSA, so that's the funding sort of side of the DFE, they have put us in contact with some of those local authorities that they're seen as sort of best practice and that we could learn from. So that work is being done. I mean, we're not reaching out to contact 20 authorities, but we're going off the guidance that the DFE are giving us on that.
Is it worth just mentioning the statutory override as well? So at the moment, there's a statutory override, so that deficit doesn't hit the general fund. And I think I'm not. Yeah, and I'm not convinced that necessarily the ones who haven't got the deficit are the really good ones. I think it's a little bit pure luck with the reserves and why they have reserves, and I think yeah.
Okay.
And some of the individual reserves are far higher than ours.
Well, that was what I always thought.
Yes,
they had high reserves.
Much higher than us.
To what extent?
Yeah.
I think Hampshire used to sit on zillions of
Yes.
reserves. So,
not sure they do still, but
they
yeah.
did, didn't they?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I think if I could raise one final question. So I noticed in there the observations around the Fletton Keys acquisition, and the suggestion at the moment that we have no write-off on that loan, and that we were taking advice on the valuation of the property going on. Now, I've not seen any of the detailed material that will have gone to Cabinet, but I think a lot of things I've read in the press suggest to me that actually there is a problem, and that the realisable value of that hotel is likely to be far less than the magnitude of our current loan plus the completion costs. And I was just wondering how confident we are that there really is no write-off on there.
So there is no write-off for the Hilton Hotel. We are in the process of preparing we have made a credit bid that has been accepted. So we are taking the hotel into council ownership, and then be preparing a business case, setting out the options for either we sell it or we develop it to completion and look to recover all our money at some point in the future. So we will impair the loan in due course, but we haven't written anything off yet.
So you expect to impair it in due course when you get a full appraisal of the cost to completion and determine what will happen after that?
Yes, yes. I think Jill, just remind me, we wrote off the interest. Did we write off the interest?
Yes, we have written off the interest already. That's the interest that we were due to receive, and we have adjusted the value of the hotel slightly between the difference between the full amount of the loan and the market value. That actually has been adjusted for in accounts.
And I think as well, even writing off the interest due doesn't mean that we don't have to pay the interest due. So we're still going to have to find that money.
Yes.
Will we pay to ourselves?
No, we have borrowed the money that we provided for the
You mean
loan.
the interest on
Yes,
okay.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Chair, Mayor.
Yes, Councillor Burns.
Just going back to the home to school transport, I don't know how big this number is. I can't see anything, but it's increased by 20%. And I'm not expecting you to have a sort of detailed number on it, but is this something that we could really look at? Because is that within our gift that we can bring that down by a substantive amount? Given that I know there are people in our group that actually provide this service. How far and wide are they doing? Is there a deal of work that's going on that we can help to bring that down? Just 20%.
So there's a number of sessions going on at the minute focusing on sort of key areas where we know we've got financial challenge or demand. Home school transport is one of those. I won't bore you with the ins and outs of it, but there is a new system that is going in at the minute that will give us greater ability to sort of understand where the routes are, the data behind it, so we can do better planning. We're looking at procurement opportunities around that, and I guess going back to my point, like if we can create some in-house provision within the city, that saves us a huge amount. The biggest savings is going to be not transporting children to out-of-area placements. So say Leicester, for example, that's where the huge cost is. So if we can create better outcomes for children, have the placements in the city, then we'll also make those savings as well. So there are a number of work streams on the go around that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Any further questions before I move on to the recommendations? I think the recommendations on page 109 are quite lengthy, so I think it's recommended the committee notes the final 2023-2024 revenue outturn as a 1.2 million overspend on the council revenue budget. They note the reserves position outlined in section 4.5.2, that we also note the MTFS Q4 update outlined in Appendix B. We also note the 2023-24 capital outturn position as being expenditure of 113 million as outlined in section 4.6, and the details of the schemes outlined in Appendix C. We note the performance of the prudential indicators as outlined in Appendix D, and the performance on the payment of creditors, debt collection performance, local taxation and benefit overpayments as outlined in Appendix E. Can members all agree to the recommendations?
Agree.
Thank you. Thank you for the recommendations are therefore agreed. So I think that then takes us on to agenda item 7, which is the 2022-2023 statement of accounts. So we're actually going back a whole year to published versions of the accounts for the prior year. So could I ask Jill Evans to introduce the report?
Thank you. As stated, these are the accounts for 2022-23. They came previously to the last audit committee some time ago now, because they were originally published on the 29th of February. There are some small changes, absolutely not material, following some very helpful comments from our acting chair, and also the fact that we looked with a new pair of eyes over the whole of capital, and therefore have made some changes to some corrections going back to both 21-22 as well as 22-23. So these are now presented to Audit Committee. They can't be approved until they've been audited, so they are presented to you for your review.
Okay. Any questions on the revised set of accounts from the committee? Okay. I think if there's no questions, Jill, I'd just like to thank you for taking my very detailed set of comments on the previous draft and reflecting those so ably in the latest draft. Now I think this is part of our difficult situation with finalising our accounts, and I think there was a little bit of me that says the sooner we move on from some of these historic years and get them closed off, the better. So I think it's recommended that the committee receive some comments on the annual accounts for 2023, 22 to 23, delegating any final approval to the Executive Director for Corporate Resources, so Cecilia, and to the Chair of the Audit Committee, and note the linked Auditor's Value for Money report for the, well, I don't think we can do that until we've discussed that, but ultimately we will note that as part of agenda item 8, the value for money for a report on this particular year as well. Can members agree to those recommendations?
Agreed.
Thank you. Well, I think we can then take those recommendations agreed, which will take us on to agenda item 8, the Ernst & Young, the EY Value for Money report for 2021-2022 and 2022-2023 accounts. So this is again taking us into the depths of history a little bit, but trying to bring us back up to date on some of the backlog that we've been dealing with in accounts. So again, I think, Jill, are you presenting this one as well?
Yes. So this is a value for money audit. It is one report covering both years, so 21-22 and 22-23. It is purely looking at the value for money aspects of both accounts. It isn't a full audit. It is just looking at that aspect of it. I think it would be fair to say that the state of our current audit and all local audits at the moment is in a state of uncertainty. But the value for money audit will be required, whatever happens going forward. So it is in that respect that it is presented to Audit Committee.
Okay. Thank you, Jill. Now, I think before I do general questions, I had one question. I think if I could address that to EY, and I have to say I was a little bit confused by your risk assessment and significant weaknesses description. So I'm just trying to look for the exact table. So I think in terms of, so I think it's page 290 out of 642 in my papers. I think it's page 7 of your report, and you've got a nice little table in there which shows your reporting criteria. It details the risk of significant weaknesses in the arrangements that have been identified by you, and it notes the number of actual significant weaknesses in the arrangements. And I think what we have there are 3 separate reporting criteria: financial sustainability, governance, and improving economy efficiency and effectiveness. And I think in the column headed risks of significant weaknesses, you've highlighted 1 significant risk identified against each of the 3 criteria, and then you've identified that there's 1 significant weakness identified against each of the 3 criteria. But when I read the detail underlying the significant weaknesses that you highlight and your commentary on the significant risks, you seem to say that under governance and the economy, efficiency and effectiveness session, you seem to conclude in your detailed commentary that there were no significant risks identified. And I wonder if you could perhaps comment on that discrepancy between your overall presentation and the underlying detail in your report.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, you are correct. The detail pages are incorrect where they say that we did not identify any risks of significant weakness. So the table to start with is correct. There was one risk leading to one significant weakness in each of the three criteria. The risks are then explained later on those summary pages, but yes, you are correct that those statements in those pages are incorrect.
But that seems to differ from the information I've received from the officers as well. So Jill, perhaps could you comment on that, on why they seem to be saying one thing to you, or you seem to be saying one thing to me, and EY seem to be saying something different?
When you raised it at pre-meeting, I suggested that I thought it could be because there was another significant risk raised, but it has since been removed. So I thought that could be the issue.
I think it would be better for us to take you briefly through the report and show you the three weaknesses.
If you could do,
It's
yes.
quite clear on the other pages, so if I can take you through it, it will become clear.
Thank you.
As the Chair said, on page 288, there is a summary of the risks. There was one risk identified within each of the criteria, and each risk led to a significant weakness. On page 292, which is where the first discrepancy arises, it does conclude at the bottom of the page that there is a weakness. So the weakness on page 292 relates to financial sustainability, where we identified a weakness in relation to financial resilience. And this is because in 2021-22, the Council did not publish a full medium-term financial strategy. That was rectified in 22-23, where the Council did produce a full medium-term financial strategy, and therefore this weakness only relates to 21-22. On page 293, in terms of governance, we raised a significant weakness in relation to the publication of the draft 22-23 Statement of Accounts, which you have just seen again at Audit Committee. This is because the accounts were published 9 months after the required 31st of May 2023 deadline. So again, this weakness only relates to 1 year, but this weakness relates to 22-23 and not 21-22.
I understand the weakness, but I'm not quite sure I understand where you've articulated the risk. And again, in particular, there's, as far as I can see, there's a significant weakness described there, but you don't describe what the risk you identified in your planning process was. And indeed, the detail says our risk assessment did not identify any risk of significant weakness in the arrangements in respect of governance. It seems to me that sort of some discrepancy between what you're saying on one table and what you're writing in the detail.
As shared just a minute ago, that text is incorrect. So a risk was identified. In terms of value for money, the risks do lead into the weaknesses. So when we're performing the work, we're performing the risk planning at the same time as performing the procedures on the value for money arrangements. So in this case, there is a weakness on each one. They are the same as the risks. So the weaknesses have resulted from those risks identified. It is just a typo on those two paragraphs that said we did not conclude that there were any risks.
So can I ask if you presented those risks to the council, to the audit committee at any stage?
So the risks are based on this report. So the risks are concluded at the same time as the significant weaknesses. And on page 288, so before the table that the Chair mentioned about the risks being identified, that does show the details of the risks that we identified. So before the one where we say one risk reporting criteria, page 288 of your papers, there's a table at the bottom of there which does describe the risks that are then flowed through into pages 292, 293 and 294. So on page 288 there is a table which says description of the risk identified. For financial sustainability, it was financial resilience for the risk that we identified. For governance, it was the publication of the draft statement of accounts. and for improving economy, efficiency and effectiveness. It was the improvement notice issued by Ofsted following a visit of the Peterborough's Children's Services. So like I said, apologies that on those 2 pages it does conclude that there were no risks identified, but that is just an error. The risks from the previous page do apply, and then the weaknesses as concluded on those pages and later on in the report are there.
So am I to take it that the summary table in relation to financial sustainability should actually report that you identified 4 risks to financial sustainability, not 1 as you indicate in the table?
No, so there was just 1 risk. Those 4 bullet points are just the work that we plan to do to address those significant weaknesses. So we identified 1 risk, but there were 4 things that we looked at.
And what's the risk?
So the risk was that the accounts were not published in time with the scales.
So why did you bother looking at the outturn reports and the NTFS if all you worried about was the publication of the accounts on time? And why do you highlight those as significant risks here when in fact you say that there's only one of them is a significant risk, and that's that we might not publish our accounts on time? I find these reports really very, very confusing, and I think there's a little bit where I'd like you just to think about how you're presenting the information you're setting out here and try and present it in a consistent manner, so at least we stand some chance of following what you're saying.
Given it's an interim report, we're happy to take that on board and we'll reflect that for the final report when we bring it back.
Excellent, thank you. If I could then just throw that open to the rest of the committee, are there any other questions or comments that other members of the committee have on this particular report? Councillor Farouk.
Thank you. So just on back of that, the weaknesses highlighted earlier, whether it's MTF has to publish a statement of accounts, do we now, presumably this is more for the officers, do we now have a robust system in place that we deliver those on time and we always deliver every year, that we don't fail and that weakness does not reoccur again in our system?
Yes, please.
So I think it's fair to say that we had 1 or 2 very difficult years when we got into financial intervention as well. And reading the report, some of that is very much out of date. We didn't have a medium-term financial plan for 21-22, and that's one of the reasons why we got into intervention at the time. As part of the improvement journey, a lot of officers moved on or were moved on. We had a brand new team in place last year, and dealing with audit queries relating to the year that hadn't been completed, as well as a new team closing the accounts for 22-23 was very, very difficult. We had interim resources and it turned out not to be as good as they ought to have been. We are, for the 23-24 accounts, we are 2 months behind the statutory deadline, which is disappointing. I would have liked to think we could close down by the end of May in this year. Unfortunately, because we also still have 2 years of open accounts, we're still dealing with audit queries and other issues, that wasn't possible. But Jill and I have had a lot of discussions about it to make sure we get the stability from the 24-25 accounts onward. We with the importance of meeting the statutory deadlines have been stressed, and hopefully by that time we will have a stable team who follow on from what they did the previous year, rather than picking up what interims did or what officers who have moved on. So I wouldn't be able to completely promise we're there yet, but we have a pretty good plan to get there for the end of this financial year. And I can see Jill is nodding, so so yes.
Yeah, sorry, if I can just add to that, yes. So, I mean, the 23-24 accounts, yes, they are late. The plan is to publish them by the 31st of July. The reality is that because the entire team was new and was recruited in September or October of last year. And the reality is that there are certain things that should be done in year, but because the 22-23 accounts weren't published until February, the things that should have been done in year were all done at the end of year, and so it's created another delay for the year that we're trying to close at the moment. But as Cecilia said, once we get past this hurdle, we should be in much smoother waters. The team will have been through that entire process once, and actually, have a better handle of what they're doing. So yes, this current year is late, but the plan is that we will next year won't be late, so we'll be back on track.
Any other questions from members of the committee? Okay, in which case I'd like to move to a recommendation on page 279, and that's that the committee receives the final interim auditor's value for money report for the years ending 31st of March 2022 and March 2023, and that we consider the recommendations within that report. Can I ask members that if members agree with those recommendations? Sorry, Councillor Jones, yes.
Yeah, that's notwithstanding that it will be picked up by...
It will be in the final version.
Yes, in which case, yes, thank you.
Okay. I think agenda item 9 we agreed we'd move to the very end, so I think that then takes us on to agenda item... Oh, this is where I'm getting very confused. So we've then got agenda item 7, the 2022-23 accounts.
But we've done that one.
No,
Well, I thought we've done that one.
10 now, governance statement.
Oh yes, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes, draft annual governance statements. So, Neil, are you presenting this one?
So, thank you, Chair. I mean, in fairness, a lot of the heavy lifting on this has been done by Steve Crabtree, so I feel slightly like a fraud. But this is the annual governance statement. The previous year's one appears in the previous year's financial statements you'll have seen. We've undertaken an exercise to update it, and happy to answer any questions or add any clarifications that if you want.
Okay, if I could just therefore open it to the committee for any questions that you may have for Neil. If there are no questions, I think just one observation from me, Neil, around the accountabilities for the preparation of this particular document. And I think going forwards, I'd like to see a little bit of a shift in the way this is dealt with. So I think my expectation is that the ownership of the statement should rest, in my view, rather more with the first and second line within the organisation, and less with internal audit. So I'd like to see Steve spend less time on the preparation of this. I think we have a corporate risk manager in place now, and we've got his plan going forwards at the end of the agenda as well. I'd very much like to see the content of the governance aspects of this dealt with by the governance parts of the organisation, compliance and legal, and I'd like to see the effectiveness of internal control elements dealt with by Jerry and the risk management framework. And I think I'd still expect Steve to have some involvement, so I'd expect him on behalf of this committee to provide input and challenge to the governance statement, but I think the preparation I'd like to see happen before it gets to Steve as well. But I think, having said that, if we could then... did you want to say something as well, Cecilia?
Yes, I just wanted to add to that. So obviously Neil is very, very new and had to hit the ground running with this particular document. And I really wanted to give a massive big thank you to Steve, really, who bailed us out last year and turned it around very, very quickly. And we did hand it over to the monitoring officer then. It didn't quite happen, and the same thing happened this year. Steve stepped in and did all the hard work on it, and we all recognised it's not quite the right way the audit committee wanted it done. But I think a huge amount of credit should go to Steve for having stepped into that space for the second year running and making sure we have a pretty good AGS. Also, the AGS goes into CLT, so we have the whole of the leadership team feeding into it. Because of the changes we've had in monitoring officers and the whole framework, it hasn't worked quite as well as we wanted it to do. It's not for lack of trying, but it just hadn't panned out exactly how it should have done.
Yeah. Did you want to say something as well, Steve, before we wrap up?
Just to say, the focus actually started on the local code of governance, which you have attached, because that was seriously out of date, so that was the focus, and we did have a really good working group pulling that all together. So I know my name has been praised there, but no, there was a working group pulling together that local code, which is the key document. The AGS, I know, will go in the accounts, but that is really concise now, because the time never went into the local code.
Thank you. Well, I think if we could then just move on to the recommendations associated with the draft annual governance statement. I think it's firstly that the committee notes the arrangements for compiling, reporting on and signing the draft annual governance statement for 2023-2024. That we've provided feedback on the content of the draft annual governance statement. And I think that subject to any amendments, that the draft annual governance statement should be submitted to the Chief Executive and Leader of the Council for signature and inclusion in the statement of accounts that are published for 2023-24. Can members agree to those recommendations?
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you. So that then takes us on to agenda item 11, and I think it's back to Steve now for the annual internal audit opinion.
Thank you very much, Chair. Standard report produced each year detailing the work which internal audit has undertaken, which revolves around our audit plan, which is agreed in March each year. What you've got in front of you are 5 separate appendices. The first one is the actual overall opinion, which is based on all the work we've undertaken, which gives us, I'm able to give a conclusion that there are adequate systems in place. We can never give full assurance that there are all systems in place which we can embed. We have not the resources to look at every single system, and nor will I expect any organisation to look at every system or be able to, in truth. So that sets out our overarching opinion, and Appendix B sets out the areas which we've covered. When we've identified issues which are significant, as in limiting of insurance, we give details of those reports, and that's in Appendix C. In terms of what I've already mentioned, we cannot look at everything. Appendix D sort of sets out a framework, an assurance framework, which we actually use to look to pick up information from other sources, Ofsted reports, CQC inspections, where there's been other inspections, etc. So we can try and glean information from those to see if they've got systems in place or not, as the case may be. And finally, obviously, we have to do a quality assurance. That is one of the things which will be coming later in the year to this committee. Our quality assurance against the new standards will be starting to map out in due course, and that will be brought before you. But the key things are just for your attention before I take questions. Adequate systems are in place, and we can provide assurance on that. Resources have been an issue in the past. As of July this year, we are now fully resourced. It's the first time since the start of, I can remember, back 2019. So we have a fully resourced team, so we can concentrate on delivering the audit plan going forward, subject to no investigations and things like that, which may skew plans, which obviously we make reference to. Happy to take any questions about the work which we've undertaken. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Can I invite any questions from the members of the committee? If there's no questions from any other members, if I could just ask a couple of questions, Steve. So, resourcing, I'd like to very much welcome the full staffing of your team. I think for me, internal audit are very important to this committee. I see them as being the eyes and ears of this committee. They provide a lot of information to the committee around what's going on across the organisation, and I think we've tried to emphasise as a committee just how much we value internal audit's input and the importance we place on the staffing levels with internal audit. So I think I very much welcome the return to full staffing for Steve's team, and I'd like this committee just to note just how hard it has been to get there, but we finally are there. I think the second question then goes on to some of the contents in Appendix E, so a little bit confused about some of the observations around who is or isn't doing this quality assessment and whether it's going to be an internal or an external assessment. So I think you make reference to the suggestion that it would be done on a reciprocal basis with Cambridgeshire, and I think we were very firm as a committee in our view that it should not be that kind of reciprocal arrangement. We saw that as being too close, and I think the last time we raised the question we were assured that it would be undertaken by an external third party. And then I think the second aspect is the elements around going forwards and self-assessment. I would welcome a self-assessment now around the new code going forwards, but I still believe that we should and indeed are required by professional standards to have an external assessment of compliance with existing codes. So could you just comment for us on what exactly is happening there?
In terms of the new code, as far as I get the date correct, it's beginning of January when those come into being. So marrying ourselves against those standards is what I see would be the best fit for the City Council. So we marry it. We have got, when we did the previous assessment, is obviously against the old standards, and we do have, there is a quality assurance against that, and obviously it would be counterproductive to see if we're still delivering against that, in my personal opinion. Because the reason I say that, because we are coming to less than 6 months before the new one comes into force, there are a lot of similarities. There is some jargon which is different. That is all being mapped out as we speak by the professional bodies, and a local government guidance note being issued. So there is nothing, yes, we could do it against the old standards, but my preferred option, as we have those new standards ready to come into being from the beginning of January, is that's what we work towards, to make sure that when we go out for our assessment, we're against those new standards. Otherwise, we do it against the old standards and potentially would have to get revisited sooner. And that is just, as I said, that's my personal thoughts on that.
And in terms of the assessment against the new standards, will that be undertaken by an independent third party, or will that be a self-assessment?
We would do a self-assessment ourselves anyway, because we want to see how, that is one thing we will do.
Yeah.
We will complete our own self-assessment to see if we identify where there are weaknesses, so we can make improvements and then go out and get the quality assessment appropriately done.
So you will have an external quality assessment undertaken on standards that you haven't been working to. I'm not quite sure how I see that working.
But by and large, those standards we are working to. There are some nuances, there's some changes in terms of descriptions. That is what is in the process of being mapped out at present with the local government.
I still don't understand how you can be assessed against compliance with a set of standards that you've not been working to, and I think that leaves me with the only option for me would be to say, have we over the last X years of the review complied with the standards which are largely similar to the standards going onwards, and have we put in place the processes to amend our internal documentation to demonstrate compliance going forwards with the new system. So I think you need the dual element of have we complied historically with the standards as they were written at the time when we did our work, and going forwards, are we fully prepared for the new standards? And I would expect all of that to be addressed by an independent third-party assessment. Yes, supported by potentially by an internal self-assessment to make their work and their job easier, but I would expect to see all aspects of that, historical compliance and preparations for the future, to be addressed by an independent third-party review. Does that help in terms of a steer from the committee as to where we'd like to see you go?
fully understand where you're coming from with that one, and as I said, yes, we have it mapped out against the old standards, and there are guidance out there that says this is the old standard, this is the new standard, it mirrors it, or where there's been those subtle changes, or some of them they are quite substantial changes. So we know where we've got to target and look at. And lots of those we have done over time anyway, and we've been doing more than we should have. But it's now some of those things are now reflected on.
I understand the goalposts have moved.
Yes, very much. So yes, I'm be quiet now. Yes, the goalpost has moved, but we'll be able to address it.
Thank you, Steve. Any other questions from any other members of the committee? Okay, in which case can I move to the recommendations, and that's that the committee reviews and then endorses the Chief Internal Auditor's annual report for the year ended 31st of March 2024, which is included at Appendix A of his reports. Can members agree to those recommendations?
Yes.
Thank you. Which then moves us on to the annual report on fraud investigations. And Steve, is that you presenting?
It is me again, Chair. Yes. So, similar to the report you just had on internal audit, this is the annual report which is produced setting out the work in relation to fraud and investigations. Some of the details of the things which have been found during the year. So, Appendix A gives you an overview of all the data and the various areas we've looked at, and some of the results which have come out nationally as well as locally. Some of the key things in there, National Fraud Initiative, and the outcomes from that, things which have been done in relation to other data sets for counter-tax support, the links we have with our joint working arrangements for the DWP, blue badges, etc. In Appendix B, we set out a fraud risk assessment. Now, this is something which we introduced last year to assess a number of our key systems and to look into what was the likelihood of things going wrong. What's the inherent risk? What was the residual risk? So similar to linking in with what Jerry has produced in relation to the risk management framework. And finally, Appendix C, there's a fraud checklist which this is the first time we've actually completed that. It's been looking at our various policies, what's in place, what does a committee do, have we got a detailed handle on what's going on. It does put some commentary in there about actions for my team going forward in relation to looking at various aspects of benchmarking. Our policies need to be refreshed. Certainly our fraud strategy, that expires this year, so that needs to be radically refreshed and brought up to the new standards. So I'm happy to take any questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Any questions from members of the committee? Yes, Councillor Anthony.
Thank you, Chair. It sounds very impressive. I just questioned on one element. You have a lot of responsibility there. Have you been granted the authority as well with that responsibility?
Responsibility in relation to looking at fraud. Responsibility for detecting fraud relies on managers. It's their systems, they should be sort of monitoring and reporting those into us. I have two officers who undertake the majority of this work, supplemented by work from internal audit. So I've got the responsibility for the overarching fraud team to manage that and to deliver against the key objectives of zero tolerance against fraud, detecting and looking to prosecute and those sort of things. Yes, I've looked at more people, but as I said, ultimately, responsibility relies with officers, with managers, to ensure their systems are working correctly.
I'm not quite sure that sort of answered the question. In terms of the authority, if a manager was to report or a member of staff, have you got the authority to ask any question, obtain any information? Can anything be denied to you is basically what I'm asking.
Well, certainly using my sort of chief internal auditor title and the internal auditor, we have unfettered access. So yeah, we can do that. And obviously there are certain legislative powers which would allow other members of my fraud team to obtain access to information from, not just from us, but from other organisations. So yes, we can get it. All cases that do come through to us will be risk assessed anyway. So we don't, get something, we must look at it. It'll be looking at some of the various aspects related to that. It's spurious and those sort of things, and answer problems. Ben could sort of go on to Ben used to have this team before it transferred to me. So Ben could wax lyrical about all the various powers and legislation. But yeah, there's certain things in place for us.
Thank you very much.
I think just as an observation for me, so I've challenged some of Steve's responsibilities for elements that are outside of internal audit. I think in terms of fraud investigations, there are some schools of thought that suggest that should sit outside of internal audit as well. But I think one of the benefits of the combination of those is very much that Steve, as internal auditor, has a degree of authority that's difficult to also convey to an operational fraud team. So I think, to go back to the question of does he have the authority, I think I'm confident as Chief Internal Auditor he has the authority if he feels the need to conduct any investigations and the powers to access any information he chooses, which makes an internal audit team, or gives an internal fraud team considerably more authority than they would have as a standalone entity elsewhere in the organisation. So I think that's one of the areas where I haven't challenged the combination of things that aren't necessarily direct internal audit. So I think that does help in terms of your question around does he have the authority to deal with it, and I think in his role as Chief Internal Auditor he certainly does have that authority.
Yes, and I can confirm that as well. We've had some pretty sensitive matters being looked into, and Steve has certainly had the authority to look into it. So I think the answer to that is yes.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. So I think if there's no other questions, oh sorry.
Sorry,
Sorry, yes, Councillor Free.
Thank you. Just a quick question about corporate investigators, and I think this is a question Cecilia must have asked you. Are those investigators almost becoming self-sufficient? In other words, are they delivering enough savings to pay for themselves? I mean, I do see on page 514 where they identify level payments of 25 grand, where they compare the electoral register to the council tax single person discount. Are these guys, or have they delivered enough savings, or is there enough scope for them to deliver those savings?
The figure you quoted, the 25,000, actually relates to the council tax support scheme, not the council tax in terms of the electoral roll. And that particular officer who was working on those was only in place part year, so they weren't full year. In terms of the savings which have been delivered already in this year, we have far surpassed. We beat that already, and we're only 4 months in. There is increased links up with DWP. We're getting more acute in terms of information given to us from the public as well, so we can do more targeted works. So yes, it is certainly paying for itself. That is something which we do make reference in there. The National Fraud Initiative, that comes online again in October. We normally get quite a few good hits, is the best word to use, the matches up front, and we target those high risk areas and get those out of the way. So yeah, it is certainly paying for itself as it stands at the moment.
Just a supplementary question, Mark and Lewis always tells us on television, and that is going through the bank statements of our own, see if there's any particular money still going through, which is perhaps ought to not to be going through. Do we have any system on that to review that continuously?
In terms of our bank statements?
Yeah.
Well, obviously there are matches going on through that. There's various bits and pieces in relation to money laundering, so if there's any significant transactions, those be raised through the policies for those. There are a number of ways which we can look at those. We do look at the bank accounts occasionally through our audit works, So that, yeah, there are ways, means and process in place to cover all those.
Thank you. What I really meant was that any money which is going to suppliers, which are probably no longer providing us the supply of that product anymore.
In terms of suppliers, obviously with the National Fraud Initiative, we do get, we take the last 3 years of suppliers, last 3 years of the data and the last 3 years of transactions. Those will go through that process, so that will identify duplicate payments where we paid somebody twice, or I think there was an occasion where somebody was paid 3 times. And also, because the data is cleansed on the system regularly of all our suppliers, there shouldn't be any. If there are new, or if somebody comes back on who's a dormant supplier, there are there's processes in place for them to be reactivated. It's a big hoops and obstacles for them to jump through. So that it will take a long time and effort for somebody to get back on the system. So they are, as I said, they were taken up automatically when they're not used. To get back on, there's got to be various checks, company checks, you name it. So I would be very surprised that the old ones are sort of coming back without all those checks.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. I should be sure.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Councillor Farooq. I was obviously not paying attention to the room very well there. So are there any other final questions before I move on to the recommendations? In which case, if we can then move on to the recommendations on page 505. As recommended, the committee receives, considers and endorses the annual report on the investigation of fraud within the investigations team during 2023-2024. Can members agree with that recommendation? Thank you. Then I think we can take it that the recommendations are agreed, which then takes us on to the annual insurance report. Steve, is this you again? I thought we'd moved insurance to risk management.
It is me again, Chair. I know it has been raised in the past as an option to look should insurance be with myself and Lot, and it was included at the time. I'm reported, I think it's minuted somewhere that it's inappropriate for it as it stands for insurance. But obviously what you've got in front of you is the annual insurance report, sets out the workings of the 2 officers within that team. We are a very good council in terms of managing insurance, in terms of having those robust processes in place to not pay claims is probably the best way to describe it. Using highways as an example, the data shows that the level of claims we actually pay out. I think we paid out 1% claims. We have robust processes in place in highways in terms of monitoring the roads and those regular inspections as and when they are expected to be done, so we can mitigate and reduce the level of claims. One of the issues which I think the report identifies, because we've had a number of years when it's been dry, it's led to issues of subsidence, and that is one of the biggest areas that the report identifies. Quite a number of claims ongoing at present. I know members in the past will be aware of, we had the issue of the Breton oak tree, which had to be removed, and there was, I know obviously that caused a lot of feeling within the media, within the organisation, with members. However, based on all the financial side and the insurance issues, and obviously identifying issues with the land, that had to come down. And obviously we're not, as a team within the council, they're monitoring that, we're linking to it with the insurance team. What you've got in front of you shows you all the statistics for the year, the levels of claims made and what we've paid and not paid. I think we've also got key actions going forward for the service. And one of the things which we're really starting to notice within the service is there are a lot of claims coming in now for misuse of data, which is coming more and more to the fore. And certainly for injury to feelings, it's something which hasn't previously been experienced in local government. I don't know if it's something which is coming across from America with their claims, but it's certainly something which the industry within local government is noticing, so we're monitoring that. So I'm happy to take questions about the work of the team, any of the results, and what we're going to do going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Are there any questions from any of the members of the committee? Councillor James.
Just one thing that I saw, Stephen, forgive me, I'm just trying to have a look at it. It's property claims have been rising both in number and value, and premium increased by 32%, and the offset by very low. Are these in lines with industry norms? I mean, what are they going up, and is there anything that we're getting, because you say we don't pay an awful lot out, so is that reflected in the premiums we're paying? Just a generic question, really.
Yes, it's in relation to the premiums. They have gone up across the public sector. As I said, it has hardened. Ours have gone up 30%, but other councils, they've gone up twice as much as that. With the reason we've seen a lot of property increases, we've had issues where there has been floodings at properties or fires, so linking in with some vacant properties where there have been fires. So we've seen increases those. We obviously put aside a figure of what we think it will be as a claim. When the claim comes in, it has been invariably higher, and obviously that's a knock on as a result onto our premiums.
Any other questions for Steve on his report? So, thank you. If you could therefore move to the recommendations on page 531, where it's recommended that the committee receives and considers and endorses the annual report on the provision of insurance for 2023-24. Can members agree with those recommendations? Okay, thank you. Then the recommendations are agreed. So then take us on to item 14, the Information Governance Annual Report. Neil, are you presenting this one for us?
If I may, Chair, can I pass this to Ben, who's really the expert and the author?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is the first annual report on information governance. So it does cover the performance and issues relating to information governance within the council. We are quite small.
Sorry, Ben, I don't think that's working. Click mine if you like.
Oh no, it's on now.
It's on now? Okay. Sorry about that. We are a small but quite wide-reaching service. There seems to be very little the council does that doesn't end up in a freedom of information request. Or something like Steve mentioned, the free. In terms of FOI, we have a central team that manages the process to ensure we have consistency in our decision making. We have seen a year-on-year increase. This week last year has been a particularly high year, going up from around about, you tend to get 80 or 90 a month to almost double that at times. That is something, as I work at Cambridgeshire County Council as well, it's something that is not unique to Peterborough. FOI has gone up. We cover a wide range of subjects, from potholes, roadworks, pools, fences, projects. As I said, the oak tree, we've had pixies and elves requests before. An invasion of pixies in the Orton area was a particularly interesting one. We do have a low level of what I would call internal review, so people challenging our answers. So a very low amount. Very low amount of engagement with the Information Commissioner as the regulator. Our plans this year really are targeted at publishing more data that people can look at. Hopefully we can use some self-service and try and bring down the burden on our colleagues across the council. Another key area that the team cover is subject access requests, which are predominantly social care of children and young people who want to understand their life in care, which tends to mean us reviewing very large, very sensitive, very complex matters and having to redact certain aspects for them. We have a very high performance of that 96% in time, which is very good considering it is one officer that mainly does that. So we continue to do well in that. I think Steve mentioned in claims for misuse of data. It's not just misuse. We do have a number of personal data breaches reported, and they're not just deliberate misuse. It doesn't just cover that. It is also human error. And the vast majority of things that go wrong in terms of how we process data in this council are related to the human at the end of it who presses the send button. I have put some figures in there about the number of types of personal data breaches we've had in the last year. I think it's 34 where an email's gone to the wrong person. To put that in context, we send an average of 10,000 emails a day. So it's not to denigrate or dismiss those as being a very small number, but it puts in context how many we do get right and how important it is when things go wrong that we look at how we mitigate and we remedy those issues as quickly as we can and speak to those concerned. In the last year we've self-referred ourselves to the ICO 3 times, which shows a low level of high risk matters where we feel that we ought to, in line with legislation, make the referral. There's been no formal action. Any points they make around training or how we can improve, we do take on board, discuss with the service and see how we can implement them. I have also covered in the report other areas for how we help compliance, and one of those is data protection impact assessments, which can be seen as a bureaucratic bit of red tape, but it does help understand how data is being used, what data we then are collecting, what we could else do with it to improve decision making, and how we can build trust with the people who provide us with that data. I'll perhaps highlight just another couple of things before inviting questions. 98% of staff completed data protection training in the last year, 99% completed cyber security, and I think we're all very well aware of our reliance on the internet and how that can go wrong. Last week with Microsoft, not a cyber incident, but we do see a huge amount of attempts at phishing and attacks on our council, as every council does, and it's important that staff are aware of not clicking on links, not putting in their passwords, so that the right training is so important. And finally this year, I'll pass back to Neil since he started passing it to me. Neil will be chairing the Information Management Board as a Senior Information Risk Owner, covering a wide range of issues to help us keep improving our management of information. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Keane.
Thank you very much. I find information governance and data breach fascinating actually. I'd like to ask you a question in relation to data breach and GDPR within the confines of social services. Often it's seen that we are sending often very highly sensitive information about vulnerable children to a single email address within the local authority. How can we guarantee that the other person picking the information up on the other side may possess a conflict of interest, may be known to the individuals that are being referred across? Has this ever been looked at? And has it ever been taken into consideration from a training perspective as well, in order to mitigate the eventuality of that happening? Thank you.
So to clarify about information coming into the council, a council officer may see that they know that person. Children's social care and adult social care both have registers of interests. They're expected when they sign up for both social care systems to declare anybody they may know. If something changes, again, they're expected to inform managers, and then we can restrict access to the records. Obviously, we have as a council some very sensitive records of well-known cases, and they are restricted. So there is a very clear policy. It is picked up in terms of social work as part of their professional qualifications. We are currently reviewing the way we restrict records to make sure that they can be accessed by people who need to. Because if you block off it for everybody and we get an urgent request, somebody's got to be able to access it. So it is picked up.
May I ask a follow-up, please? In respect to your point about they declare their interest, what kind of interests is it? What type of information do they provide in that register of interest? Thank you.
I think in terms of it's whether they know people, so their relationship to them. So if it's a family relative, they need to declare that. If it's somebody they know in the neighbourhood, or those that they know. I used to do it in terms of council tax where you have to declare anybody you knew. So we expect them to tell us if they do know somebody. We're obviously reliant on them telling us, but I think looking at the data, we have very little incident where we've got inappropriate access to records.
Thank you, no, that's useful. So it's when the referral comes in that they then declare that interest.
They should.
Prior to.
That they may declare it as soon as they walk into the job on their first day. It may be that something changes during their time of employment and they need to declare it then because there was no referral before, but 2 years later there is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Please, Mike.
Yes, Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chair. I just find this sort of percentage of sort of freedom of request. Is there any sort of trend in that? Just I personally find it a bit depressing that people, don't people just ask, or is there this huge conspiracy theory? What are we finding that what are we hiding? Or what do people think we're hiding? More to the point.
I would genuinely like to say there is a trend, but I've looked at it. There is no one single thing that's driving it. I think, in general, councils are having to make tougher decisions on how they spend money. Now, it may come from the media, it may come from members of the public trying to understand that. I think we talk about child transport early in education, the rising costs of that. You also see providers or prospective providers looking for when contracts might be up, when we might be spending. But equally, things like potholes are a long-term trend. Something like the oak tree will generate some. There's nothing we can say is driven by that one thing. I think people have got used to FOI being a means to uncovering information from us. It's quite often portrayed as something they've forced us to disclose, but they're just asking us. It's little more than that. We're asking her as a question as you're asking me now, and I'm answering it. There's a governance framework around FOI that is helpful to councils, but we try and answer as many as we can.
Thank you.
Trust issue.
If there's no further questions, then perhaps you could move on to the recommendations, which are on page 545. It's recommended that the committee note the performance of the council and the Information Governance Service, that we've considered areas of compliance, and that we've approved the proposal to receive a 6-monthly report on personal data breaches to demonstrate the council's commitment to protecting personal data. Can members agree to those recommendations? Thank you. Those recommendations are agreed. Which then takes us on to agenda item 15 and the risk management update. Jerry, do we have you online?
Yeah, apologies I'm not there in person, so I hope you can all hear me okay. Appendix A and B. Appendix A is the risk management framework that's provided to the committee for review and comment. I appreciate the time that Mike's already taken in going through this document. Very, very substantial feedback. He's happy to a point with the structure, but has pointed out a number of areas where the content needs to be improved, built upon, expanded out. And at the moment, I'm working on a plan with timescales to provide that assurance for him, and I'm hoping to share it with him in the not too distant future. The annual risk report is the first time we've done that. I just thought I'd keep it relatively simple in terms of the process that I'm trying to implement, the tools that I'm using, and an extract from the Strategic Risk Register. I understand there'll be a deep dive later on in the year, so the Strategic Risk Register will be provided in full then, so you'll see everything, but this was just a snapshot in time. It is reviewed, the Strategic Risk Register is reviewed every month by the CLT, and to date it has changed every month. So happy to take any questions.
Any questions on this from the committee? I think perhaps just a few observations from me. So I think this committee has encouraged the development of risk management within the council, and I think the appointment of Jerry is an important step towards that. I think the documentation and the framework that he set out here is a very clear starting point. I think in terms of the feedback that I've given to Jerry on these documents, I think I would very much suggest that the documents indicate an element of immaturity in the risk framework, and that's only to be expected. You know, Jerry has only recently been appointed. This is a significant step forward. I think the framework covers the areas I would expect it to cover, but there's clearly areas where there's room for it to be strengthened and improved, and I think I've asked Jerry to come back to us with a plan for how he proposes to take this whole function, this whole activity forward and strengthen it. But again, I would see this as being an important tool for the Audit Committee and for the Council as a whole to manage its risks. I thoroughly recommend the moves and the directions that we're travelling in, and I think Jerry is well placed now to take the whole function and activity further forward over time as well. So thank you for the work you've already put in, Jerry, and I look forward to your plans for the future. So I think if there aren't any other questions from the committee, then if we could perhaps just go to the recommendations on page 557, and that's that the committee reviews and provides comments on the risk management framework and the annual risk report included in Appendix A and B of the report. Can I ask members if they're in agreement with those recommendations? Okay, thank you. We can take the recommendations then as agreed. Which then takes us on to our own annual Audit Committee report. And this is a report that the Audit Committee itself prepares on the work that we've done over the last year. The intention of this is to provide an update to the full council on the work that we've been doing and the elements that we've been involved in. So, Matt, can I just ask you to introduce the report in a little bit more detail?
Thank you, Chair. So yes, as you've stated, this is the committee's annual report for the 2023-2024 year. So this is in line with good practice recommended by CIPFO and is also in line with the committee's terms of reference to produce an annual report on its work, including a conclusion on the compliance with the CIPFO position statement. You will note this normally comes to Audit Committee in March. Unfortunately, due to capacity issues that Democratic Services had at the time, we weren't able to prepare it for that meeting. So going forward for this year, that report in draft will come to the March meeting with the committee to go to July 2025 full council. But in this case, the report is here today and will then be submitted to full council for noting and approval at its meeting in October. I'm happy to take any questions on the report.
Any questions for Matt on the report as presented? Thank you. Well, if there are no questions, then if we can move on to the recommendations which are on page 593, and that is that the committee reviews and approves the draft annual Audit Committee report shown in Appendix A for submission to the full council in October, and that you delegate authority to the chair in consultation with the Audit Committee group representatives to agree any minor changes to the report before its submission to full council. Are members content with those recommendations? Indeed. Thank you. And I will take the recommendations as agreed. Which then brings us on to a couple of administrative elements on our agenda. So agenda item 17, which is an update on our use of investigatory powers under REPA. And there are no updates on REPA to bring to the committee at this meeting.
I was going to mention we are in the process of being inspected by IPCO at the moment by letter, which is an unusual approach, to be process. We've had face-to-face visits, we've had a Teams call, and now it's just by letter. So at the net, when we've got the results of that, I will bring that back to committee with any recommendations or observations they've made.
Thank you. And then if we move on to agenda item 18, the approval of write-offs exceeding £10,000. This again is a regular item that's brought to this committee to enable us to keep an eye on write-offs that are taking place. And again, there are no updates to provide to the committee on write-offs in excess of that criteria, and therefore no update for the meeting. Which then brings us on to final item, or the penultimate item on our agenda, which is the work programme for 2024-2025. Matt, can I ask you to introduce this report?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is a report for noting for the committee's forward work programme. You will note it's been informed by the attachment that was on the annual report, where Steve has very helpfully mapped the work programme to the revised terms of reference, which were approved by full council at its meeting in May. And this is a report for noting.
Thank you, Matt. And just I think as an observation from me before I throw it open to the committee as a whole, I think as a committee we worked hard on our revised terms of reference, and I think they provide a significant step up in terms of the level of scrutiny undertaken by the Audit Committee. And I think this work programme is an important way of how we translate that much strengthened terms of reference into real action and real activities that enable us to deliver against that terms of reference. So thank you, Steve and Matt, for the work, that the time you've invested in putting this programme together for us. And I think it certainly provides us with a very challenging agenda going forwards in terms of how we deliver on what we see as the responsibilities of this committee. I think if I just end my remarks there and invite any other questions or observations from members of the committee. Okay, well, I think there's lots of nods of agreement and assent. I think certainly there are a number of members here who've been on the committee for some time and contributed to the work we did on strengthening the terms of reference to the committee. So thank you all for your past contributions to that, and I look forward to sharing this exciting new terms of reference with the committee as a whole. And I think therefore we can note the rolling programme for the coming municipal year, and I think I look forward to sharing this agenda with you all in the future. Which I think then brings us back to agenda item 9 and the external audit plan. And I think my proposal for this is that we invite EY to introduce their report, and then I think once they've introduced the report, at that point if we then go into private session, at which point the press and public will be excluded from that part of the meeting, on the grounds that it contains information exempt under paragraph 3 of part 1 of Schedule 12A to the Local Government Act 1972 as amended, and that it would not be in the public interest for this information to be disclosed. So can I seek a proposer and a seconder for that recommendation? So thank you as a proposer, Councillor Jones, and as a seconder, Councillor Cahoon. Thank you.
We do just need a vote on that, Chair.
So,
we do just need a vote on that.
Oh yes.
Or at least agreement from the committee.
Yes. Do we have agreement from the committee as a whole that that's the correct way forward? Thank you. Well, I'll take it that the committee as a whole are in agreement with the proposal and seconder, and that we will take this as the way forward on the committee. So, if first of all I could invite EY to introduce their plan.
Thank you. So by way of introduction, I'm Mark Bush, I'm a signing partner and I'm responsible for 23-24 onwards. So this is our plan, how we plan to get sufficient assurance for audit opinion purposes over the 23-24 financial statements and value for money responsibilities. Just pull out a few highlights for you, some key information. So starting on your page 329, we set out our materiality level, which gives you a sense of where we're interested and why. So we have an overall materiality level of £9.4 million, which is based on a consistent basis with the last audit, with a tolerable error of 4.7 million, which is based on 50% of that materiality level. That is at the lower end of our range because of errors in the previous audited set of accounts, and therefore a higher expectation that there will be errors in this one until proven otherwise. But we'd be reporting any audit difference to the committee above £470,000, so you get a sense of all audit differences that we identify, whether adjusted or unadjusted by management. Pages 325 to 328 set out the audit risks that we have and how we plan to get assurance over them in overview, and they're supported by some detailed pages in section 2. So in overview, grey risks are good on a stable basis from prior years, but there are some new risks and we have taken some out from the last audit that was completed. So overall there are 3 fraud risks, 4 significant risks, 3 inherent risks with 2 areas of focus. I think it's just key to focus on the new risks this year. So the first one is over the valuation of the solar panel asset portfolio, which was an issue for the completion of the last audit with a level of error within it. So we have a higher expectation there could be errors in this period and therefore a significant risk. As previously discussed earlier this evening, the Hilton Hotel loan and the valuation of it is a consideration for audit purposes, and the correct valuation of it at the 31st of March and whether that loan needed to be impaired for the administration of the company building it. The third area of focus is financial or the finance team capacity. Again, as referenced earlier, a change in the makeup of the team and the capacity of that team, and we have already noted that the 31st of May publication date was missed, as Cecilia referenced, with the rationale she set out, and clearly we are waiting to see whether the draft financial statements are completed by the end of this month. Page 328 does then set out audit risks that have been reduced and taken out of the plan across 6 areas. So whilst they're relevant to the audit procedures that we may perform, they're reduced to a level at which we don't need to bring them to your attention as a committee, as they are not so significant anymore. Page 331 sets out that we're taking a fully substantive approach to the audit and using data analytics to ensure that we have full sight of the whole population of transactions from which we can then sample test. And then moving on to group scope, on page 333, we note, or bring to your attention, that there's one new entity that's come into scope for the inclusion within group financial statements this year, which is Peterborough Higher Education, a property company, and that's linked to the to bringing into operation the university and the associated evaluation of that as an investment property. We have issued group instructions to the auditor of the subsidiary companies, which are assets. Building on for our other agenda item, we have value for money section set out on page 348. We haven't completed our detailed planning risk assessment yet, and that will be performed as part of the audit, but we have identified within this plan on that page 5 areas where we will give due attention to and consider whether they are risks to underlying arrangements. We will provide a commentary against that in our auditor's annual report, which is scheduled for your January meeting. In terms of the timeline, our execution audit phase is due to kick off in the last week of July into the first week of August. Clearly that is dependent upon having a draft set of financial statements to audit and the complete provision of data analytics and working papers supporting those financial statements, and we would aim, if that is the case, to complete the audit by late October into November and bring our audit results report to you in November. When we are able to sign, our audit opinion will depend on legislation, and we can pick that up in that discussion after this item. Then lastly, to highlight on page 369, audit fees. So 2023-24 is the first year of the new audit contract with public sector audit appointments. That contract has given rise to increases in audit fees nationally, somewhere in the region of 150% is the average increase. And that would bring this year's audit in line with the cost, or the full cost of the last audit that was completed, which is 2021. So those, I think, are the key messages from the detailed report, but happy to take questions and then go wherever you wish, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think at that point I'd like to take the committee into private session. If there's any members in the, any attendees in the public gallery, they're invited to leave. If there are any officers who don't feel that they need to remain for the remainder of this item, I'm quite happy for them to leave at that point if they choose. But I think the very much what I'd like us to have now is a full and open discussion on where we're going with this audit, because audits of the financial statements, as you've obviously already gathered from the earlier agenda items, are significantly in arrears. There have been numerous proposals as to how we're going to remedy those elements. Unfortunately, the change of government has created confusion around that, but I think very much we're now at the point where there's room for us to work out how do we move forward from here? How do we deal with the past? How do we make sure that we get back on track? And I think what we've got here is a proposal from EY as to how we get back on track. But I think, I have some concerns about what's documented here, and certainly officers have written to EY to raise some significant questions around how do we deal with the open years, the past years, how do we stop the confusion about public sector audit getting in the way of the resolution of this year's set of accounts in the way that we get this council back on track. So perhaps if we could